Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. And welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We appreciate you all joining us. Milou, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Looking forward to talking about disasters, different kinds of IT and cyber disasters today. I think this is kind of one of your areas of expertise, so I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, like you have told me in the past that sometimes I show up as daytime Brian, and this is going to be one of those episodes probably.
That's
where
where
I-
he's a little bit more focused and less playful. So
Yeah, focus in a this is what I do every day kind of a manner. So I will purposely, of course, not talk any sort of company line with the company I work for, but this is kind of a little bread and butter for me in my day-to-day job. So definitely wanted to kind of draw some distinctions here because I think this is basics to me. This isn't something that is unique to my company's message, but is more of just you got to think about things a little bit differently sometimes when it comes to cyber.
yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about an IT disaster, how would you really kind of explain that to our audience?
Yeah, I usually view an IT disaster as those that we've traditionally kind of looked at as far as natural disasters, things that go wrong with the data center that require us to have to restore some parts, if not all of the IT infrastructure. Floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, explosions, power outages, those types of things that harm or prevent the IT infrastructure itself from working. Sometimes, IT disaster may be putting a little bit too narrowly just because it oftentimes does involve the people and process aspects of things. So a company I used to work for previously, we had a workforce recovery space. Should something happen to our physical location where the people sat, even when we segregated our data center from our typical office cube type area into two separate locations, we recognize the fact that should something happen to our main building, it gets burnt down, we can't access it for some reason, we needed another place where we could all sit and actually work. So people and process should not be forgotten in the process of us talking about it being an IT disaster. But that is usually the context we're talking about is some sort of effect to the data center that more often than not takes the entire thing out. We do tend to focus on that a bit more when we talk disaster recovery, but it could be a partial loss for some reason too.
So just like a widespread outage, whether that's from a natural disaster or like a human error or a widespread outage, like a big power outage to your data center or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's usually requiring us to go to backups or some sort of replication of data to recover from those. You mentioned human error. That was one that I neglected, but is an important one because definitely have seen situations where people accidentally press that big red button thinking it was an exit door unlock type of a button when in fact it was the cut the power button. So it can be a disaster at that level. It could be a disaster at the level of, hey, somebody pushed the wrong update out to Windows or Linux. It caused everything to go belly up. We've recently seen the CrowdStrike situation that I think would fall into this bucket as well because it took out pretty much everybody's Windows servers. Yeah. So yeah, definitely not. It doesn't have to be the entire data center is no longer functional for some reason. It could be that something else was going on there too.
Yeah, a system that impacts your employee laptops or something like that so that people can't access their systems to do their work.
Yeah, it could definitely be something like that.
Okay, so we talked about kind of what a typical IT disaster is. How does that then compare to when we're talking about what a cyber attack is?
Yeah, so cyber attack is things like ransomware, or things like some sort of denial of service, um, something that it's probably a bad analogy, but an IT disaster tends to be an axe where, massive damage happens all at once, whereas a cyber attack can oftentimes be more of a scalpel where it's usually a bit more precise. By no means does that mean that you can't have a cyber attack that is an axe. Denial of service is an example of that. But it's usually pretty targeted in those situations as well. Usually attributed to somebody external with malicious intent, but could be somebody internal with malicious intent, where that person could be acting as an agent for some competitor, some external country, or nation state type of an actor. Think spies, if you will. Somebody gets turned and does damage to harm the company for the sake of some other company or country. Um, Usually involves some sort of data theft or data attack. That's where ransomware would come in. But usually is more nefarious and targeted, but also sometimes be a bit more surgical, meaning it doesn't always happen all at once. Sometimes it's a drip, drip, drip situation where it happens over time and results in a very different type of damage pattern, which we'll get into.
Yeah, so where a cyber attack is generally pretty calculated with malicious intent and is going after data, company files, an IT disaster, right, doesn't necessarily have that limited scope. It's the whole system, right? It's more of like a prolonged outage or something that is really impacting the data center as opposed to the data itself.
Yeah, yeah. The only caveat I would put on that is it doesn't have to be necessarily widespread. I had an incident once where we lost power at the data center, and of course that was an disaster in and of itself. But when things came back up, which was fairly quickly, we found out that some systems simply just didn't properly come up, and it was pretty wide. It was widespread. It wasn't complete by any means, but it did turn into a disaster for us. Um, that we had to deal with. So, not there's always caveats to all of these generalizations, I guess is my point there.
Yeah, so when we really kind of compare it, it's really IT disasters usually, an environmental factor or hardware software malfunction, system outage, and it's really impactful to the organization in the same way that a cyber attack is, but it's a different type of disaster in the sense that the data is not necessarily being like stolen or beholden, ransomed, right? It's really more it's inaccessible.
Yeah, yeah, and you can consider the natures of the threats passive and active to some extent. Again, gross generalizations to some extent, but the passive attack of, oh, if you want to talk insurers and legal, it's an act of God. It's a thing that nobody planned for, um, and it just happened, and now you got to deal with it. Cyber attacks are usually somebody planned it. Somebody calculated how to make this thing happen to you. Um, in those very broad within both of those, what the event could be. So passively, it could be a hurricane, it could be a tornado, it could be a fire, it could be a flood. Again, none of those things are anything anybody's planned against you. Whereas a cyber attack is, we want to get in there and we want to disrupt their data or steal their data or prevent their ability to do something. It could be to process data. It could also be to pump gas through a pipeline, as we've seen in the past. It could be to enrich uranium, which we've seen in the past as examples of cyber attacks. And so being able to actively pursue somebody's environment to make it stop, if you will.
Awesome. So now we've defined kind of what each of those is. How do companies really start to plan for those?
Yeah, and this is where I think one of the biggest differences ends up being between the two that people really need to consider. Because many of us, or when I say us, I'm talking businesses at the business level, have been planning for disaster recovery for potentially decades now. What happens if this data center were to stop being functional? What would we do? And we sit there and we think about what all the potentials are. Um, and really, it's in both cases, it's about continuing business or business continuity. Both of those fall under the umbrella of business continuity. But traditional disaster recovery planning is usually well-defined recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. Recovery time being how long is it going to take us to get operational again, and recovery point being how far back in time are we going to restore from. And that recovery point for disaster recovery is going to be generally pretty short. That's going to be mostly defined based on how often you take backups. So if my recovery point objective, again, it's an objective, is to only lose 3 hours worth of data, should there ever be an incident. For disaster recovery planning, I'm going to go and take backups every 2 to 3 hours. Anything longer than that leaves me the potential of being longer than that recovery point objective. And those are usually set by the business or should be set by the business. Whereas a recovery time objective is much more complex in that regard. It has to do with how quickly we can identify that there was an issue, how quickly we get alerted, how quickly we bring the team together, how quickly we can get our recovery resources in place. Sometimes there's a decision, like the example I gave about the power outage causing a bunch of systems to not boot back up. If it's not a total disaster, how is there a percentage of the environment that has to be down for us to pull the trigger and say we're going to restore to a different site? Or is it a certain level of functionality? Is it the type of disaster that happened? What defines how we're going to respond to the event? So you need to think through all those things and decide which ones are the ones that we're going to plan for, and ideally plan for all of them, so that in the heat of the moment, when I get a call at 2 a.m. Saturday morning, I know I can pick up this book. I can pick up this set of instructions that'll tell me what to do based on the situation and help guide those decisions, so we're not making decisions when we're tired and freaking out.
Got it. So it's a well-defined plan to making sure that the company understands that in the case of an IT disaster, right, they have a pretty good plan of how to restore their backups, how to potentially fail over to a different site, and how to get back up and running.
Yep. Yep. And that all happens, that all has to be planned ahead of time. So you got to think through what the potential issues are again. If the data center is totally gone, what do we do? Well, all of our backups were stored in the data center. If you didn't plan ahead, then you're kind of SOL at that point. There's no returning. So you got to plan, okay, where do we put our backups? Do we replicate them? Do we put them on a tape and keep them somebody's car? Do we put them inside of a vault somewhere in a mountain? Those types of things.
Yeah, and that's why there's the benefit, right, of cloud hosting providers now often offer like multi-availability zones, right? That if one of the data centers goes down, the data is automatically replicated and fills over to a different site so that hopefully there's additional redundancy. Obviously, if there's a major natural disaster that's wiping out large portions of a country, then that, is no longer helpful. But
Yeah.
for the most part, that's pretty unlikely. So
And maybe a situation where people say, you know what, if it's that widespread of a disaster, our business doesn't matter. And, maybe we assume we'll never come back as a business. Maybe we'll assume that, hey, we've got days or weeks or months to recover. And all we needed to make sure is our data is somewhere. And if it takes us weeks to recover it, so be it. That's fine. That's not going to be our primary concern at that point.
it's interesting too what you said about the backup strategies as well, of saying, because I feel like most companies end up doing like daily backups and like maybe hourly snapshots, but for the most part, it's usually like a once a day backup. So their recovery objectives can only be as good as the fact that they're only capturing that like single daily backup, right? So I think
Yep.
that's like kind of an interesting caveat to think through.
Yeah, the 24-hour tends to be kind of the default. I've seen in a lot of organizations. I would say over the last 10 years or so, I've been seeing a lot more nuance to that rule of thumb, where they're saying, okay, well, this particular database is where all of our transactions live. And if we lose an hour of that, we've lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, whatever that might be.
Uh-huh.
It's important to think through those things because each system, a web server that, we push content to it once every couple of weeks. Do I need to back that up daily? Are the log files being generated on there about the only thing that changes on a daily basis? Is that worth capturing? Can we capture it in a different way? Those types of decisions. Again, when it comes to planning, you need to plan those things because at the time of disaster is not the time to be thinking about that.
Yeah, so how do organizations plan for cyber attacks? Because obviously there's the hope that that's never going to happen to your business, although unfortunately it's quite likely that it might. So how does a company plan accordingly for cyber attack?
Yeah, another similarity between the two is that you pretty much have to plan for it because you have to assume that it is going to happen. And by not planning for it, you are essentially declaring that your business isn't worth recovering, in my opinion. Like it is, if I were a shareholder of a company and they got hit by a cyber incident and they're like, oh, well, we never planned for this, then I would sue for negligence, to be quite honest, because that is active negligence at this point, to take a pretty hard stance. So when we consider a cyber attack again is usually very purposeful, very thoughtful. Um, some of the planning is the same. Some of it's going to be very different. So when we think about recovery points and recovery time objectives, those tend to be a little bit more fungible than they are in a disaster because the nature of a cyber attack tends to be there's this concept of dwell time. Somebody entered your environment and then they sat there. And maybe they're moving very slowly. Maybe they're just observing. Maybe they're cataloging your environment, slowly worming their way through to what we call persistence. So the more systems they're in, the harder they are to pull out. Even if you did have to do a massive restore event, maybe you restore the malware that they're using as their entry point into your environment, and now all of a sudden they're back. So recovery points can be really tough to figure out because you don't know how far back you need to go in order to truly kick them out of the environment. And this is where we see some really long recovery times for some businesses that get hit with cyber attack because they restore and everything gets re-encrypted because they restored all the malware. So that can hurt the recovery time objective as well. And that piece becomes much more variable than even the disaster recovery was because you got to figure out where that point in time is. You've got to figure out what systems they touched. It can be harder to tell which systems were actually impacted because they're not necessarily down, even though they may have malicious software on them. So understanding what all you have to recover, understanding where you can recover to, because if your disaster recovery site is directly connected to your primary site and they've infected one side, odds are they've been able to jump over to the other side if you don't have controls in place to isolate the two. So where you recover to can make a difference. At what point in time do you recover from can make a huge difference as well. So there's a lot more to consider and figure out. And again, the more planning you can do, systems that help to identify these things, systems that will actively create an isolated environment so that you know that nothing's getting into that environment, so you know it's clean to begin with, can be very important. And having the plans around how to utilize those assets, because the variety of disaster that you can have in a cyber incident can be probably less easy to figure out ahead of time, because you've got human ingenuity constantly moving the goalposts, constantly changing their attack vectors, constantly changing what they're doing to cause a business damage, and trying to understand how to take down your defenses, how to be as silent as possible in some cases, especially if their focus is espionage, and to make themselves as persistent as possible. They're getting really smart, and they will actually delete backups in order to make it more likely you'll pay out the ransom. They're doing funky things to make sure you've got no data to restore from, so that you're more likely to pay. So a lot of insidiousness that you've got to you've unfortunately got to think like the worst of us as a human race, to figure out what they may be thinking about doing, and how you can not necessarily prevent it, because there is a prevention aspect of it. But when it comes to the recovery side of things, you have to assume that they're gonna do something nefarious, and you got to figure out how to recover from that.
Yeah, and a lot of the planning also has to do with the internal preparedness too of how to respond. So, of course, we talked about having a business continuity and disaster recovery plan. On the cyber attack side, incident response plan is really important to making sure that you have the IRP defined and that you have a real playbook for different attack scenarios so that your team has some idea of how to respond in the worst case, right? There's
Yeah.
nothing worse than showing up to an incident and being like, we don't know what we're supposed to do. So thinking through those playbooks and then also doing a lot of prevention ahead of time as a part of your planning, doing vulnerability assessments on a regular basis, doing external penetration tests to identify system weaknesses, patching those things, ensuring that you just have a valid patch management program, right? Of just actually pushing updates to your software to making sure that stuff isn't falling through the cracks. And then from there, you kind of have the baseline of the preventative measures that you can do to also plan accordingly.
Mhm. Yeah, and of course, part of planning is trying to prevent, trying to avoid. So just like in a, to draw a parallel on the disaster side, having redundant power sources, having battery backups, having diesel backups for long-term power outages, having the proper security around your environment so that, a truck running off the road isn't going to go straight through the drywall and into your data center, that you've got a brick wall around it to stop those types of things. Like, there's some pretty crazy possibilities that I've seen people consider when it comes to building a data center, and they do look like bunkers for a reason, because particularly in this day and age, a cyber attack or some sort of malicious intentional attack is definitely possible. But some of those just come back from, hey, we got to try to, a small tornado isn't going to be enough to knock over this building. Goes into that kind of level of planning.
So we've thought about planning. In the worst case, right, we have something happen, either an IT disaster or a cyber attack. From there, obviously, there's the initial response, and then it really goes into the recovery phase of the life cycle. So let's talk through that. What does recovery look like with an IT disaster?
Yeah, and just like this conversation is going to go, the better you do with your planning phase, the less you'll have to deal with in your recovery phase, because you'll have automated a lot of the recovery. And this is one of those places where you mentioned the incident recovery plan. I mentioned disaster recovery plans. Like, both of those report into or fall under the banner of business continuity. And that's really where you need to define what is important to your business to operate. If we're counting the number of dollars per hour that we're down, what systems need to come up first in order to enable that number to go lower? And how quickly can we lower that dollars per hour that we're losing metric? And so through that planning, hopefully we've automated a lot of these things. We've identified the systems that need to be involved, the people that need to be involved, that, ideally you've got as easy as pushing a button. For IT disasters, that's a lot easier, because the types of disasters are usually easier to predict, as I mentioned, and tend to be much more cut and dry. So our data center is down, push the button and start the restore process. And I've seen environments, I've helped companies where that can be highly, highly, highly automated, to the point where, I've sat down and I've talked to businesses, and I'm like, if a tornado comes through here and hits this building and takes out your data center and your workforce area, and it goes along this line, and I will just randomly draw a line in the air, how many of your houses are within a mile of this building along this line? And it helps them to really understand the fact that you can't always count on the people to show up in the case of a natural disaster. That's one place where it's a little bit easier in a cyber disaster, is that the people probably will show up, unless it's a really widespread or part of a larger potential kinetic war, which is a sad thing to consider these days, but it's definitely a legit branch of some of the militaries in the world. The downside is that what to plan for, what to automate, can be a lot less clear. It may require a lot more if-then statements in your plan. And Being able to determine which automation pieces to run could be potentially a little bit more challenging and require a little bit more human effort. So that's one place where fortunately the two are different in different ways and actually work well. That, in a natural disaster, it's a lot easier to understand what the plan needs to be, but you won't have as many people, so high automation is possible and necessary. What systems to rebuild, where to restore, what needs to be restored, what can't be restored, are all a lot more unknown when it comes to the cyber attack. And then you also have variations around forensics and needing to understand who did this to us, what was their intent, what were they after. Depending on the type of business you are, the FBI or some local law enforcement or federal law enforcement may get involved to need to see what your environment is. They may need to see the environment. So you may need to encase your existing environment in amber. And, and sometimes maybe it is easier to just completely restore into an isolated environment, make sure it's clean, and then open the doors back up to business. Meanwhile, letting security researchers deal with the original environment.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to also just kind of highlight that the need for forensics comes in probably more with the cyber attack than necessarily it does with the IT disaster, because for the
100%.
most part with an IT disaster, we're pretty clear of like there was this natural disaster, as opposed to with the cyber attack, right? We really might need to freeze those assets to be able to investigate, to figure out what happened, and also, put a litigation hold in place for if in the lucky happenstance that this criminal can be found, right? And working with authorities to actually making sure that, they can prosecute effectively. So I do think that the forensics comes in a little bit more with the cyber attack, which is something to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be part of that plan because it's there and generally is going to be necessary, but maybe a situation where it can work in parallel with other things, which is kind of nice. You don't necessarily have to wait for the forensics to end before you can get started. Now, elements of forensics will have to happen, and that is part of the job of understanding what happened and what got affected so that you can properly restore from there.
How do the impacts vary between an IT disaster and a cyber attack for the company itself?
Yeah, we touched on a bunch of those. But to put a point on it, IT disasters tend to be more all-encompassing, more complete, more widespread, and generally are going to probably be less outage time if you plan properly, because you don't have to decide what point in time to restore from. You generally are going to be replicating your backups, so you'll have the most up-to-date, ready to go, usually in a warm or a hot state, so there's not even a restore necessary. And you know where you're going to restore to because you've planned, hey, if I'm going to plan for a hurricane, I'm going to go a lot further than if I was planning for a tornado or a flood. So being able to restore and feel confident that that recovery site is not affected by the same disaster. You will potentially have financial penalties, reputational damage, have to deal with customer satisfaction, those types of things. But when you put this under the banner of an act of God, people tend to have a little bit more grace. Not to mix a metaphor there, but to allow you to say, yeah, I know a tornado hit you, so I'm not going to feel as negatively towards you. Whereas in a cyber attack, you've potentially lost my social security number, my credit card number, my driver's license number, some PII, PHI type stuff that is unique to me and could be used against me by an attacker. I'm a little bit more pissed about that. Not to mention the loss of whatever I was paying you to do, or the service that you were giving me because of the outage itself, which honestly is probably going to last a little bit longer because, again, you've got a lot more decisions to make as to how to recover, where to recover, what's safe. Have they stopped attacking us? Have we properly kicked them out of whatever our recovery environment is, whether it be the primary site or secondary site? Some companies rely on, we can't afford to have two full sites, so we're just going to rely on a cloud provider to spin things up, and we'll have to wait for those resources to spin up in the case of a disaster. Um, and of course, there's all sorts of take the iceberg metaphor, under the water, that you don't always necessarily see, that could take weeks or months or potentially even years to actually come to fruition, as you lose customers, as you deal with litigation, as you pay the bills for the incident response teams that you had to bring in externally, those types of things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the impact between the two from like a financial perspective is, right, like an IT disaster very much generally costs the loss of productivity, the cost to actually repair, to fix the thing, to making sure that the systems are back up and running, versus the cyber attack has a lot of potential of having a longer tail after the fact of the legal fees, the damage to your actual like branding, reputational damage. Then potentially, if you did have a data breach, are you paying for credit monitoring? Are you also then investing in better security tooling after the fact, right? So I think there's potentially a longer tail of cost to the organization from an impact perspective with a cyber attack than an IT disaster.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes there's hunting down the criminals and dealing with law enforcement to help them do that. That's not nothing on your team to have to deal with, even if it's, everything else is back to business as usual. FBI comes by and says, "Hey, we've got this lead. We want to check this other thing out." And then you may have the cost of maintaining that infected environment or that infected data for years, potentially, like you said, legal hold type stuff.
How does the response vary?
I think we covered the response quite a bit as we talk about plans and the things that you need to do. But to kind of reiterate them directly for the purpose of the outline that we're looking at, um, the IT team tends to be the primary when it comes to the response side of things, because there's not any real security incident. So your server, your applications, your data, your networking teams, getting involved and ideally pushing a button that executes a well-known, well-planned plan that's highly automated. It's really about just getting stuff back up and running and losing as little data as possible. Whereas with a cyber attack, it is incident response plans. It is, how long have they been here? Who was it? What were they after? What did they do? How would they potentially get back in again? How did they get in the first place, so that we can hopefully plug that hole? We don't just restore the same hole they used before, which is a tale as old as time these days. Um, and then you got to make sure you've got them contained. You got to make sure that you know what they have done, and then you can start the restore. And at that point, you've involved not only IT, but almost everybody. I mean, quite frankly, there's HR angles, there's legal angles, there's compliance angles, there's public relations angles, there's every subdivision of IT that there is at this point. Your GRC team's getting involved to help to understand when laws potentially got broken along the way, or reporting that needs to happen. I'm fond of saying, once the breach happens, there's a clock ticking as to what you have to report and when you have to report it. So being able to pull all these things together requires a massive team. And so that planning needs to involve everybody in a cyber event. And it tends to be we talk about security being everybody's game. And this is one of those situations where it definitely becomes everybody's game. Very few people are sitting on the sidelines. Whereas in an IT disaster, it's generally just the IT team. Some of the application business owners may get involved when it comes to testing to make sure things are up and running, to evaluate how much data was lost, and if there's any way to recover the lost data that didn't get captured as part of a backup or replication job. Obviously requires a lot more planning, as we mentioned, on the cyber incident side of things. So it can take a bit longer to deal with that. And, the timing of things, like we mentioned before, is going to take a bit more.
So if we bring us out of what is the so what is the takeaway for the audience today between the two?
Yeah, the takeaway from the two is really, the whole point of this is to say they look a lot the same, but they're still very different. Hopefully everybody that's listening to this, their business has a disaster recovery plan. They have a business continuity plan. The business continuity plan can be reused for a cyber recovery plan, because theoretically the business recovery plan is kind of agnostic to any of the details of the disaster recovery aspect of things. This part of the business is the moneymaker, so it needs to come up first. And this part of the business is highly dependent on this other part of the business. So there's a chain of chain of recovery that needs to happen there. If people aren't able to access our main building because the building doesn't exist, or the building is uninhabitable, or we can't get into the building because all the doors are locked because we don't have our IT equipment. This is how we're going to deal with it. If our OT system is down because of whatever happened, this is how we're going to continue to manufacture or do the things that we need to do. That business continuity plan, it theoretically should be that high level. What's it take to run this business plan? So you can definitely start with that. As you can start to consider the cyber recovery side of things, the disaster recovery plan can be a guide and it can be reused, but don't just pick it up and be like, cool, I'm just going to scratch out disaster and write cyber and make a copy of it. That's not going to work. In the worst case scenario where you've got to restore the entire environment, if you set things up in an isolated manner for the disaster recovery, 80% of it may apply, 90% of it may apply. Some high percent of it may apply because you're picking up and you're just restarting somewhere else with a whole restore process. What you restore, what point in time you restore is the part that you can't define ahead of time. You can define how you're going to calculate that, how you're going to figure that out. You could put in systems theoretically to help you figure that out and to track when they entered and to scan for malware and those types of things. But you're still going to have to put in that piece of the puzzle into your cyber recovery plan that does not need to exist for the disaster recovery plan, generally speaking. So very different ways to plan for it, very different skill sets because you've got that wider team. So you got a higher level of coordination, both internal and external. So the PR aspect of things, the reporting to regulatory agencies is going to make a big difference there as well. If a tornado hits my building and I need to restore somewhere else, do I need to tell the government at all? Probably not. Short of, just general disaster relief type stuff. But if I have a cyber incident and I got hacked by a nation state, yeah, I'm definitely going to have to report that to the federal government. They're going to want to know about that. So that needs to be a part of that plan. Again, on the cyber side, that doesn't necessarily exist on the disaster side.
I think it's helpful to just walk through these differentiators, right? Because I think this is something that a lot of individuals in tech know that we have a need for a disaster recovery plan, but they might not necessarily understand the nuance between what's a cyber attack versus an IT disaster. So I did think it was worthwhile to just kind of like break those things down and really explain that, both of them are not good for an organization. Both of them can be really tumultuous, but there are things that organizations can be doing proactively that do also differ between planning for an IT disaster versus a cyber attack.
Yeah, definitely. And this is somewhat of those this is going to be an evergreen episode to some extent because, bookmark this one. If your company's not actively working on something like this might be something worth coming back to when and if that does become a thing. Ideally, you'd have some sort of cyber recovery plan already in place. So if you're listening to this and you're in a position to push that for your company, this might be a good episode to start sharing with people and help them understand that you're not as prepared as maybe you think you are just because you have a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan in place and think that that's going to be the solution there. So yeah, two very different incidences. I definitely something that I like to talk to people about to make sure that they're aware of the fact that like you've got to plan for them differently because in the fog of war, and I hate using the war analogy, but that phrase just works so well. In the fog of war, you don't want to be thinking about how to change your disaster recovery plan to mold into a cyber incident because it's going to go out the window pretty quick.
Awesome. Well, I think we can wrap it up there, but I think this was a really good episode to just talk through different types of disasters when we're talking about IT. So I think it's helpful to just kind of highlight how companies can plan and prepare for those different types of incidents and how to make sure that they have what they need to.
Yep. I wish everyone good luck out there with all that, because it's not an easy thing to prepare for or to deal with when the time comes, but it'll be a lot easier to deal with if you have the right plan in place, and that's where all the hard work needs to be.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on another episode of Socializing Security.
Take care, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.